The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns of Rosemary Cottage, where Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell had arranged what she confidently declared would be the most delightful tea party Little Wickham has seen this season. The garden presented a picture of quintessential English charm, with hollyhocks nodding against stone walls and carefully arranged tables draped in crisp white linens. The finest china had been brought out for the occasion, delicate porcelain cups and saucers that caught the afternoon light and reflected it in tiny rainbows. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her pale blue cardigan and observed the scene with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to find genuine pleasures in the simple rituals of village life. She had arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying a small basket containing her contribution, a batch of seed cake that had earned her numerous compliments over the years, though she suspected the praise had more to do with village politeness than culinary excellence. The characters. Assemble. Mrs. Hartwell glided toward Miss Marple with practiced grace, a handsome woman in her early 60s with silver hair arranged in elegant waves. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful that you could come," she exclaimed, though Miss Marple's keen eyes detected the slight tension beneath the hostess's smile, the particular anxiety of someone whose reputation might be judged by the gloss on her jam. Near the refreshment table stood Mr. Ambrose Blackwood, a London gentleman who had recently purchased Mountfield House. He was a handsome middle-aged man in a suit that forgave much, wearing success like a boutonniere. Miss Marple watched as he cut a path through the gathering like a glossy motor car through a village lane, his charm distributed with calculated generosity to each guest he encountered. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, the village postmistress, engaged Mr. Blackwood in animated conversation near the rose arbor. She was a thin, energetic woman with sharp features and an unfortunate tendency toward gossip that made her both invaluable and dangerous as a source of village intelligence. Beside them stood Colonel Percival Rooke, whose lawn was a sermon on straight lines and who had, Miss Marple recalled, expressed himself forcibly on the subject of boundary hedges and the liberties of developers. Dr. Lionel Kent arrived fashionably late, as doctors do, carrying the faint fatigue of a man in whom many people confide at inconvenient hours. His nod to Miss Marple contained 40 years of mutual witness to the births, deaths, and misunderstandings that comprised village life. The fatal cup. "Tea, Mr. Blackwood?" asked Mrs. Hartwell, reaching for her favorite teapot, the one with the small chip under the spout that she always turned away from view. "Please," he replied with that particular smile men sometimes offer to hostesses. "No sugar, if you don't mind." Miss Marple observed Mrs. Hartwell's momentary hesitation as she selected a cup painted with violets, her own favorite, usually reserved for herself. An odd impulse seemed to make her pause, as though cups had destinies. The sugar tongs, Miss Marple noted, were slightly sticky, and there was an irregular lump in the basin, chipped from a larger piece as if someone had been careless with the sugar hammer. The conversation flowed around topics typical of village gatherings, the upcoming harvest festival, concerns about new development, speculation about the unseasonably warm weather. Miss Marple listened with half an ear, while her observant mind catalogued the small currents of attention and tension that flowed beneath the polite surface. The moment of crisis. It was during Reverend Merriweather's impromptu speech about community spirit that Mr. Blackwood's face suddenly altered. It did not go pale or red, it simply went wrong. He made a sound he would not have made in company, a dry, rasping cough that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his chest. The violet-painted cup slid from his fingers with a delicate chime against the saucer, tea spilling in a graceful arc across the white linen. There was a moment, an exact heartbeat, when nobody moved, because movement would acknowledge what could not, perhaps, be happening. Mr. Blackwood's hand clutched at nothing. His body sought the chair behind him and found only sunlight and shadow. "Lionel," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. Dr. Kent had already abandoned his plate of seed cake, moving with the swift economy that comes from decades of medical practice. He knelt beside Mr. Blackwood, checking for vital signs with professional thoroughness, though Miss Marple could read the grim conclusion in his expression before he spoke. The aftermath. "I'm afraid it's too late," Dr. Kent announced quietly, his professional composure intact despite the circumstances. "Mr. Blackwood has passed away." The transformation of the gathering was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, teacups were abandoned, and the carefully maintained atmosphere of genteel sociability evaporated like morning mist. "People make different sounds when shocked," Mrs. Pemberton uttered a sharp "oh," as if someone had misspelled her name, while Colonel Rook swore with military directness. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needles still clicking softly as she observed the various reactions of her fellow guests. Mrs. Hartwell had gone quite pale and gripped the back of a garden chair for support. Dr. Kent was already taking charge, requesting that someone fetch Constable Pritchard and that the garden gate be secured. Miss Marple's observations. As the reality of their situation settled over the gathering, Miss Marple found herself considering several interesting details. Mr. Blackwood had specifically requested no sugar, yet there was that irregular lump in the basin, and the sugar tongs bore a suspicious stickiness. Mrs. Hartwell's hesitation before selecting her own favorite cup seemed significant in retrospect, as did the careful way she had positioned the teapot to hide its chip. Most intriguing of all was Dr. Kent's reaction. For a man who had spent decades dealing with death in its various forms, he seemed unusually affected by this particular loss. There was something in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, that suggested this wasn't entirely the random tragedy it appeared to be. The peaceful afternoon in Little Wickham had taken a decidedly sinister turn, and Miss Marple found herself once again in the familiar position of witnessing the moment when the veneer of civilized society cracked to reveal darker truths beneath. As they waited for the police to arrive, she began to consider the questions that would need answering. What had really happened to Mr. Blackwood? Was his death truly natural, or had someone at this genteel gathering harbored murderous intentions? The answers, she suspected, would prove far more complex and disturbing than anyone could imagine. But then again, in her long experience, they usually were. This concludes the first section of Murder Over the Afternoon Tea. The mystery will continue to unfold as the village reacts to this shocking death, and Miss Marple begins her characteristic quiet investigation into the web of secrets and motives that lie beneath Little Wickham's peaceful surface. Constable Pritchard arrived with the breathless authority of youth, his notebook clutched like a talisman against the unfamiliar territory of sudden death in respectable society. His boots squeaked against the damp grass where spilled tea had darkened the lawn, and he cleared his throat twice before speaking, as if rehearsing his voice for a more experienced audience. The transformation of Mrs. Hartwell's elegant garden party into a crime scene seemed to perplex him almost as much as the death itself. "Now then," he announced with ceremonial gravity, producing his notebook, "I'll need statements from everyone present. Nobody leaves until I've spoken to them." He surveyed the assembled guests with the systematic thoroughness he usually reserved for his prize-winning vegetable garden, though Miss Marple suspected this particular investigation might require considerably more subtlety than his usual repertoire of bicycle thefts and boundary disputes. The village theories begin. The reaction among the gathering was immediate and varied, each person responding according to their nature and relationship with the deceased. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward with the eager efficiency of someone who had been waiting her entire life for such an opportunity, her sharp eyes already cataloguing every detail for future dissemination. "Constable, I was standing right beside poor Mr. Blackwood when it happened," she declared, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of an eyewitness. "Such a shock, really. He seemed perfectly well one moment. quite jovial actually, telling me about his extensive renovation plans for Mountfield House. Said he intended to make it the finest property in the district. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Though between you and me, I wonder if he might have had enemies in London. A man doesn't simply abandon a successful business to move to a village like ours without reasons. Colonel Rook harumphed his agreement, drawing himself up with military bearing. Sudden heart failure, most likely. Saw it in India, you know. Perfectly healthy chap one day, keeled over the next. The heat, the pressure, does things to a man's constitution. He paused, his expression growing more thoughtful. Though I must say, Blackwood seemed robust enough. Been walking the boundaries of his property every morning, regular as clockwork. Disturbed my roses on more than one occasion, actually. Still, these city chaps always push themselves too hard. Dr. Kent interjected with professional authority, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he cleaned his spectacles. The man was under considerable stress, I'd imagine. Moving to a new area, establishing himself in the community, these things take their toll. He spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his medical opinions accepted without question, yet there was something in his manner that suggested his certainty was not quite as complete as his words implied. Family connections emerge. Young Timothy Fletcher, Mrs. Hartwell's nephew who had been helping serve the refreshments, hovered uncertainly at the edge of the group. He was a pleasant-faced young man in his 20s, recently returned from London where he had been working in some capacity that nobody quite understood, but everyone agreed sounded very modern and important. "Aunt Evelyn," he said softly, approaching Mrs. Hartwell with genuine concern. "Perhaps you should sit down. You look quite pale." "I'm perfectly fine, Timothy," Mrs. Hartwell replied with brittle brightness, though she accepted the chair he offered. "Just concerned about poor Mr. Blackwood, naturally." Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed her skirt, and Miss Marple observed how her gaze kept returning to the overturned violet-painted teacup, now lying in two glistening halves upon the grass. The clues reveal themselves. As Constable Pritchard began his methodical questioning, Miss Marple found herself studying the tea service with renewed interest. The sugar basin stood askew, one irregular lump the size of a half-walnut sitting apart from the others like a sulking child. When May, Mrs. Hartwell's young maid, reached for it with the swift instinct of tidiness, Miss Marple's voice carried gently across the garden. "My dear," she said mildly, "perhaps we might cover that with a saucer and leave it for now. One remembers a dreadful misunderstanding once at the Women's Institute when someone tidied away what oughtn't to have been touched." May froze, pink blotches rising at her collar, while Constable Pritchard, grateful for the guidance, set his notebook beside the sugar basin like a sentry. Miss Marple's keen eyes had also noticed the sugar tongs, their tips dull with a smear that might have been from a damp lump or from fingers hastily wiped clean. Dr. Kent's earlier examination of the scene had not escaped her attention either. She had observed the briefest lift of the broken teacup to his nose before he set it down again with unusual care. It was what a good doctor might do, perhaps, though the deliberateness had felt particularly intent, as if he were confirming rather than discovering something. Whispered revelations. Mrs. Pemberton, having positioned herself as the unofficial chronicler of events, drew Mrs. Elsie Jenkins into a corner near the herbaceous border. "Heart attack? Nonsense, Elsie," she hissed, glancing over her shoulder at the constable. "Did you see his face? Not a natural color at all. And that registered letter he sent to London just yesterday, I processed it myself at the post office. Very urgent, it seemed." The mention of London correspondence sparked additional whispers throughout the gathering. Timothy Fletcher's expression grew troubled as he murmured to his aunt, "Didn't Mr. Blackwood mention having a cousin visiting? Someone from his old life in the city?" Mrs. Hartwell's composure faltered momentarily. "Miss Lila Grant, yes. She arrived last week. I believe they had some family matters to discuss." The careful way she chose her words suggested there was considerably more to the story than she was prepared to reveal in present company. Miss Marple's growing suspicions. From her chair, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation of the assembled company, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm that seemed to help her organize her thoughts. The positioning of the teacups, the conversation fragments she had overheard, the subtle tensions between various guests, all painted a picture that warranted careful consideration. She noticed young Mr. Finch, the local solicitor's clerk, keeping nervously glancing at the tea table, specifically at the overturned cup and the scattered sugar lumps. His discomfort seemed disproportionate to mere shock at witnessing a sudden death, suggesting he might know more about Mr. Blackwood's affairs than his modest position would typically warrant. The village, Miss Marple reflected, was indeed a tapestry woven with threads of long-held secrets, petty jealousies, and unspoken resentments. Mr. Blackwood's sudden death, far from being a simple tragedy, felt like a needle sharply pulled through that fabric, threatening to unravel it entirely. The immediate reactions, the eager theories, the subtle shifts in posture and tone, these were not just random responses to shock, but the first telltale signs of deeper currents flowing beneath the quiet surface of Little Wickham. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the reality of their situation settled over the gathering, Miss Marple found herself considering several intriguing possibilities. The irregular sugar lump, Mrs. Hartwell's hesitation over her favorite violet cup, Dr. Kent's suspicious examination, and now the mysterious London cousin. Each detail added another layer to what was becoming a considerably more complex puzzle than anyone had initially imagined. In her long experience, the truth about such matters usually revealed itself through patience and careful attention to the small inconsistencies in human behavior. And there were, she was beginning to suspect, quite a few inconsistencies that would require her gentle but persistent investigation. The county motor arrived with the measured authority that transforms a village tragedy into official business. Inspector Craddock stepped through the garden gate with the quiet competence Miss Marple remembered from their previous encounter during the unfortunate affair at the vicarage. Unlike young Constable Pritchard, whose notebook had become a repository of village speculation rather than factual evidence, Inspector Craddock possessed the methodical temperament that serious investigation required. Professional assessment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Craddock announced with calm authority, "I understand this has been distressing for everyone present. However, until we determine the exact cause of Mr. Blackwood's death, I must ask you all to remain available for questioning." His gaze swept the assembled company with practiced assessment before settling on Dr. Kent. "Doctor, if you would provide your preliminary findings." Dr. Kent stepped forward, though Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his hands as he cleaned his spectacles. "Based on my examination, Inspector, Mr. Blackwood appears to have suffered some form of acute systemic reaction. The rapidity of onset and the particular symptoms I observed suggest the possibility of poisoning, though proper analysis will be required for certainty." The word fell upon the gathering like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and speculation in all directions. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened with undisguised fascination, while Colonel Rook muttered something about "damned unsporting business" under his breath. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to diminish before their eyes, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of implication. "Poisoning," she repeated faintly, her gaze drifting to the broken violet cup lying in fragments upon the grass. "But surely that's impossible. I prepared everything myself, just as I always do." Inspector Craddock made careful notes while directing Constable Pritchard to secure the tea service as evidence. "Mrs. Hartwell, you poured Mr. Blackwood's tea personally." "Yes, Inspector. He specifically requested no sugar, I remember quite clearly." Her voice carried the defensive brightness of someone whose hospitality had been called into question, though Miss Marple detected deeper currents of anxiety beneath the surface. Miss Marple's kitchen. Investigation. While Inspector Craddock established his systematic examination of the scene, Miss Marple found herself naturally gravitating toward the practical concerns that others might overlook. She approached Mrs. Hartwell with gentle solicitude. "My dear, perhaps I might check on young May in the kitchen." The poor girl seemed quite distressed by all this commotion. Mrs. Hartwell nodded gratefully, and Miss Marple made her way through the French doors into the cottage's comfortable kitchen. She found May by the scullery sink, her hands plunged in cold water and her face blotched with anxiety. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, settling into a chair beside the girl, "all this washing can wait. Sit down and take a breath." May obeyed with the helpless compliance of youth confronted by genuine kindness. "I did everything just as Mrs. Hartwell instructed, miss," she burst out, the words tumbling over one another in their haste to escape. "The good china from the sideboard, the violet cup included, and I boiled the water proper. I wiped the sugar tongs with a clean cloth, but they've gone sticky again somehow, and I don't understand how." "The violet cup," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, as if accounting for crockery were the most absorbing subject imaginable. "Mrs. Hartwell's particular favorite, I believe." "Yes, miss. She said it would be nice for a special guest, that Mr. Blackwood was important these days. Only—" May's fingers twisted anxiously in her apron. Only she hesitated. She did, as if she couldn't quite decide whether to keep it for herself. She always uses that cup for her own tea. Miss Marple filed this information away with the careful precision of a librarian cataloguing rare volumes. "And who else came near the tea arrangements before the guests arrived? To admire your work, perhaps?" May frowned, casting her mind back through the afternoon's preparations. "Mrs. Pemberton arrived early, asking about napkins. That was before I set out the cups. Mr. Finch popped his head in too, said he'd left his cigarette case somewhere, though I didn't see him touch anything. After I laid out the service, only Dr. Kent asked for a clean spoon, said one had a smear of something on it, just a tiny speck, and I gave him another from the drawer." "How very thorough of him," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Which spoon was that, do you recall?" May's flush deepened. "I can't rightly say, miss. I arranged them all the same way, just as Mrs. Hartwell prefers. It was from the left-hand pile, I think, but I couldn't swear to it. The London connection emerges." Miss Marple had just returned to the garden when a figure appeared at the gate. A young woman with fashionably short dark hair and a scarlet scarf that she untied with quick, agitated movements. "I'm Lila Grant," she announced, the name falling with the weight of long-awaited revelation. "Where is Ambrose? They told me at the village. Someone said—" Mrs. Hartwell rose halfway from her chair, then sank back down as if her strength had suddenly deserted her. "Miss Grant, I'm so terribly sorry. There's been an accident." Something flickered across the young woman's face. Disbelief, anger, then a grief that seemed to emerge sideways, as if she had been prepared for many things, but not for this. "He promised," she said under her breath, apparently to herself. "He promised everything would be settled before anything like this could happen." Inspector Craddock stepped forward with professional courtesy. "Miss Grant, I'll need to speak with you. You were staying with Mr. Blackwood at Mountfield House." "I arrived 3 days ago," she replied, her eyes making a swift assessment of the assembled company that struck Miss Marple as more habitual than situational. "We had family business to discuss." She caught Mrs. Pemberton's speculative expression and added, rather too quickly, "Private family matters." Mrs. Pemberton's smile carried the particular satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "Family business indeed, though I believe they weren't blood relations, were they, Miss Grant?" Lila's chin lifted with defiant pride. "Some families are chosen, Mrs. Pemberton. The bonds can be stronger than mere blood." Gathering tensions. Colonel Rook chose this delicate moment to interject with military directness. "What I'd like to know is whether this changes his confounded development plans." Blackwood intended to push a new carriage drive straight through my hedgerow. My prize hedgerow, I might add. Really, Colonel? Reverend Merriweather protested, though his tone suggested he was rather enjoying the drama. There is surely a more appropriate time for such concerns. Property matters don't wait for convenience, Reverend, the Colonel replied grimly, though he subsided under the combined disapproval of the company. Near the evidence table, young Mr. Finch, the solicitor's clerk, seemed to be hovering with an aim he couldn't quite declare. He had the pale, anxious look of someone whose responsibilities exceeded his experience, and Miss Marple observed him glance repeatedly toward the wrapped tea service with obvious distress. "Looking for something, Mr. Finch?" she inquired with gentle interest. He started visibly. "My bicycle key. Thought I might have dropped it near the chairs." "How inconvenient," Miss Marple replied sympathetically. "I always attach important things to my person, but that's perhaps a feminine precaution." He fled with murmured thanks, though Miss Marple noted that his attention had been focused not on the chairs at all, but on the carefully wrapped evidence that Inspector Craddock had already secured. Subtle observations. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and Inspector Craddock continued his methodical questioning, Miss Marple found herself considering several intriguing details that others had overlooked. The sugar tongs bore not only the stickiness May had mentioned, but also a tiny scratch on one arm, so small as to be nearly invisible, yet precise enough to suggest deliberate contact with something harder than sugar. Dr. Kent's behavior continued to puzzle her. His request for a clean spoon suggested familiarity with contamination that went beyond normal medical caution, and his careful avoidance of the herbaceous border, where foxgloves nodded innocently in the afternoon breeze, seemed particularly significant for someone of his botanical knowledge. Most intriguingly, the pattern of relationships seemed to center around Mrs. Hartwell herself, whose garden party had provided the perfect opportunity for someone with intimate knowledge of village social customs to act upon whatever desperate circumstances had led to this moment. The hesitation over her favorite teacup, the careful preparation of refreshments, the insider understanding of guest preferences, all suggested that this crime had been planned by someone who understood the intricate choreography of Little Wickham's social rituals. Building mystery. As Inspector Craddock concluded his preliminary interviews and arranged for Mr. Blackwood's removal, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of motivations and secrets that had been revealed in the space of a single afternoon. The mysterious London visitor, the disputed property boundaries, the urgent correspondence, the careful positioning of teacups and sugar lumps. Each element added another layer to what was becoming a considerably more intricate puzzle than anyone had initially imagined. The peaceful village of Little Wickham had revealed itself to be a place where long-buried resentments and carefully guarded secrets could erupt into violence with shocking suddenness. Someone among this genteel gathering had harbored murderous intentions, and Miss Marple suspected that discovering their identity would require all her accumulated wisdom about the darker aspects of human nature. As the last of the official business concluded and the guests began to disperse into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she organized her thoughts. The truth, she knew from long experience, would emerge through patience and careful attention to the small inconsistencies in human behavior. And there were, she was beginning to suspect, quite a few such inconsistencies that would require her gentle but persistent investigation before this particular mystery reached its resolution. The morning following the tragedy arrived with the gray solemnity that seems to accompany serious police business in small villages. Inspector Craddock returned to Little Wickham bearing the weight of preliminary findings that transformed yesterday's shocking accident into something far more sinister. He found Miss Marple in her cottage garden, tending her roses with the methodical care she applied to most endeavors, though her mind was clearly occupied with matters more complex than horticulture. Official confirmation. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock began without preamble. Settling into the garden chair, she indicated, "The preliminary analysis confirms our worst suspicions. Mr. Blackwood died from digitalis poisoning, a concentrated dose that would have acted within minutes of ingestion." Miss Marple continued her work among the roses, though her movements became more deliberate. "Digitalis," she repeated thoughtfully. "From the foxglove, naturally. Such a common plant in village gardens, though one would need considerable knowledge to extract and concentrate the active compounds effectively." "Precisely my concern," Inspector Craddock replied, accepting the cup of tea she offered with automatic courtesy. "This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or opportunity. Someone planned this carefully, understanding both the victim's habits and the social circumstances that would provide cover." The case against Dr. Kent. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook with systematic thoroughness. "Dr. Kent has emerged as our primary suspect, I'm afraid. He possessed the medical knowledge necessary for such sophisticated poisoning, had access to digitalis through his practice, and demonstrated suspicious behavior during the tea service." The inspector's confidence was evident as he outlined the case. "May confirmed that Dr. Kent specifically requested a clean spoon, claiming the original bore some form of contamination. When we examined his medical bag yesterday evening, we found traces of digitalis extract in a small vial, more than would be typical for normal cardiac treatments." Miss Marple paused in her rose tending, her expression growing thoughtful. "Dr. Kent has served as our village physician for nearly 40 years, Inspector. It seems rather extraordinary that he would suddenly develop homicidal tendencies at this stage of his career." "Nevertheless, the evidence is compelling," Inspector Craddock continued. "We've discovered significant financial pressures. Dr. Kent has been struggling since the National Health Service changes reduced his private income, and his wife's medical expenses for treatment in London have placed him under severe strain. Blackwood's proposed clinic would have represented the final blow to his financial stability." Miss Marple's reservations. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she considered this information. "Inspector," she said carefully, "in your experience, do guilty parties typically draw attention to evidence that might incriminate them? Dr. Kent's request for a clean spoon, his examination of the teacup, these actions seem rather conspicuous for someone attempting to conceal a crime." Inspector Craddock frowned, having considered this point himself. Perhaps he was attempting to establish an alibi of sorts, appearing helpful and medically responsible while actually covering his tracks. "How curious," Miss Marple observed mildly. "In my limited experience with such matters, criminals typically dispose of evidence rather than carry it about in clearly labeled containers. It seems almost as if someone wanted the digitalis to be discovered." The violet cup revelation. As their conversation continued, Miss Marple found herself returning to a detail that had troubled her since the previous evening. "Inspector, might we consider the matter of Mrs. Hartwell's violet cup more carefully? Young May mentioned something rather interesting about its placement." She set down her gardening tools and faced him directly. The cup was originally placed at Mrs. Hartwell's own setting, her customary position as hostess. Only at the last moment did she decide to honor Mr. Blackwood by serving him from her favorite piece. If someone had prepared that particular cup with poison, intending it for the hostess herself— Inspector Craddock's pencil paused over his notebook. "You're suggesting Mrs. Hartwell was the intended victim?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied diplomatically, "that a murderer relying on social customs might have anticipated that the hostess would use her favorite cup herself. Mrs. Hartwell's impulse to honor her guest was generous but unpredictable. Village speculation." By afternoon, the village hummed with theories and speculation. Mrs. Pemberton, having established herself as the unofficial chronicler of events, held court at the post office with the authority of someone who had processed Mr. Blackwood's urgent correspondence to London. "That Miss Grant," she confided to anyone within earshot, arguing with poor Mr. Blackwood right outside these very windows. Something about betrayal and money owed. Mark my words, there's more to that family business than meets the eye. Meanwhile, young Mr. Finch continued his nervous hovering around the edges of the investigation, his pale complexion and obvious anxiety drawing speculation about his involvement in Mr. Blackwood's legal affairs. Colonel Rook, ever practical, wondered aloud whether the development plans for Mountfield House would proceed, while Reverend Merriweather offered pastoral comfort to Mrs. Hartwell, who remained in a state of genteel shock. Deeper complexities. Miss Marple spent the afternoon visiting various members of the EE community, ostensibly offering comfort but actually gathering the small details that others might overlook. From Lila Grant, she learned of significant business arrangements that would have affected multiple villagers. Investments, partnerships, and announcements that could have created both winners and losers in Little Wycombe's quiet social hierarchy. Dr. Kent's financial difficulties proved more extensive than initially apparent. His wife's condition required expensive treatment in London, and the proposed competing clinic represented not just professional rivalry, but potential financial ruin. Yet something in his manner during their brief conversation suggested a man more puzzled than guilty, more concerned with understanding what had happened than concealing his own involvement. The pattern emerges. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself considering the intricate web of relationships and motives that had been revealed. The evidence against Dr. Kent seemed almost theatrical in its completeness. Too convenient, too obvious, too dependent on assumptions about desperate behavior. The true murderer, she suspected, was someone who understood not only the mechanics of poisoning, but also the psychology of investigation. Someone had orchestrated events with considerable care, manipulating circumstances to direct suspicion toward an innocent party while concealing their own involvement behind a facade of shocked respectability. The careful positioning of evidence, the convenient timing of suspicious behavior, the almost theatrical nature of the crime itself, all suggested a more sophisticated mind at work than simple desperation would typically produce. Growing certainty. The real villain, Miss Marple murmured to herself as she prepared her evening tea, is still walking free among us, believing their crime has been perfectly concealed behind the obvious guilt of others. The digitalis, the violet cup, the sticky sugar tongs, the nervous young solicitor's clerk, each element was part of a larger pattern that someone had arranged with meticulous attention to detail, but patterns, Miss Marple knew from long experience, eventually revealed their creators. The question was not whether the truth would emerge, but whether she could unravel it before an innocent person paid the price for another's careful deception. As night settled over Little Wycombe, the village appeared to sleep peacefully, but Miss Marple remained wakeful, her mind working through the possibilities with the patient determination that had served her well in previous investigations. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, she was certain, and with them, perhaps, the first clear glimpse of the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly simple tragedy. The murderer had planned well, but they had not accounted for the quiet persistence of an elderly lady whose understanding of human nature ran deeper than their carefully constructed deceptions. And that, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction, might prove to be their undoing. Inspector Craddock arrived at Rosemary Cottage with the methodical determination of a man whose preliminary theories had been shaken by overnight reflection. The evidence against Dr. Kent, while substantial, possessed a theatrical quality that troubled his professional instincts. Real criminals, in his experience, rarely left such convenient trails of incriminating evidence, and the doctor's behavior seemed more consistent with puzzled innocence than calculated guilt. Systematic re-examination. Miss Marple found herself once again in Mrs. Hartwell's sitting room, ostensibly delivering a tin of seed cake to poor May, but actually observing Inspector Craddock's more thorough investigation. The inspector had arranged the evidence with scientific precision, the wrapped tea service, the mysterious sugar lump, and several items that had emerged from his search of the premises. "Mrs. Hartwell," Inspector Craddock began with careful courtesy, "we've discovered something rather interesting in your schoolery." He produced a small square of waxed paper, the kind typically used for wrapping sweets or preserving delicate items. This was found beneath the sugar basin after yesterday's events. It bears traces of a sticky substance that our preliminary tests suggest may be significant. Mrs. Hartwell examined the paper with genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand, Inspector. I use such paper for my lemon drops occasionally, but there were none yesterday. I prepared only the usual refreshments." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this development. "How curious," she observed mildly. "One wonders what might require such careful wrapping at a garden party where everything was served from proper dishes." The London visitors. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two gentlemen whose expensive motor and London tailoring immediately marked them as outsiders. They introduced themselves as representatives of Blackwood's business firm, come to settle urgent matters regarding his estate and recent financial arrangements. "Inspector," the senior partner announced with professional gravity, "we must inform you of certain irregularities in Mr. Blackwood's recent business dealings. There are suggestions of diverted funds and unauthorized investments that may have created significant enemies." This revelation cast the previous day's events in an entirely new light. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with keen interest, Mrs. Hartwell's genuine shock, young Timothy's nervous glance toward his aunt, and the notable absence of Mr. Finch, who had been expected for further questioning. The critical discovery. It was while Inspector Craddock interviewed the London gentleman that Miss Marple made her most significant observation. Through the sitting-room window, she glimpsed Mr. Finch hurrying past the cottage gate, clutching a leather satchel with obvious anxiety. Something metallic caught the afternoon light as he adjusted his grip. A pair of sugar tongs, identical to those used at yesterday's party, save for a distinctive scratch along one arm. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, interrupting the business discussion, "might I suggest we speak with Mr. Finch immediately? I believe he may have information crucial to our understanding of yesterday's events." When Constable Pritchard located the young clerk, his nervous demeanor had intensified considerably. The sugar tongs, Miss Marple had observed, were indeed in his possession, and his explanation for carrying them proved thoroughly unconvincing. "I often bring my own utensils when taking tea socially," he stammered, his face flushing crimson. "One cannot be too careful about hygiene, you understand." Miss Marple studied the tongs with gentle interest. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Finch, though I notice this particular pair bears a rather distinctive scratch. Might that have occurred during use?" The pattern emerges. Under careful questioning, the truth began to emerge in fragments. Mr. Finch had indeed been in Mrs. Hartwell's kitchen before the party, ostensibly searching for a mislaid cigarette case. During that time, he had access to the prepared tea service, including the sugar basin and the carefully arranged utensils. "The irregular sugar lump," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "was not entirely sugar, was it, Mr. Finch? You used those tongs to scrape something from its surface, or perhaps to apply something to it. The scratch on the metal and the sticky residue on the waxed paper suggest a substance that required careful handling." Inspector Craddock examined the evidence with growing understanding. "You prepared a concentrated dose of digitalis, crystallized it, and attached it to a sugar lump, but Mr. Blackwood specifically requested no sugar in his tea." "Precisely the problem," Miss Marple continued gently. "Your plan required someone to use that particular lump, but the intended victim's preferences made that uncertain. So you employed the waxed paper to transfer the poison to a more reliable delivery method." The motive revealed. Under the weight of accumulating evidence, Mr. Finch's composure finally cracked entirely. His position as solicitor's clerk had given him access to confidential information about Mr. Blackwood's business dealings, information he had been selling to competitors and creditors for months. When Blackwood discovered the betrayal and threatened exposure, Finch faced not merely dismissal, but criminal prosecution and social ruin. "He was going to destroy me," Finch whispered, his voice barely audible. "Everything I had worked for, my entire future, all gone because of his vindictive nature. I couldn't let that happen." The method, as Miss Marple had suspected, proved more sophisticated than initially apparent. Finch had prepared the digitalis solution and used the waxed paper to apply it to the inside rim of Mrs. Hartwell's favorite violet cup, knowing her social customs well enough to predict which guest would be honored with its use. The sugar lump and sticky tongs were deliberate misdirection, designed to focus suspicion on the obvious delivery method while concealing the true one: justice and reflection. As Inspector Craddock led Mr. Finch away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. A young man's greed and desperation had led to murder, nearly destroying an innocent doctor's reputation and shattering the peace of their quiet village. The careful observation of human nature and attention to small inconsistencies had once again revealed the truth hidden beneath the surface of respectability. Mrs. Hartwell, pale but relieved, poured tea from a different service entirely. "To think," she murmured, "that my own hospitality was used as a weapon. Poor Mr. Blackwood, honored with my favorite cup only to meet his death from it." "Evil often disguises itself as ordinary courtesy," Miss Marple replied gently. "But in my experience, the truth has a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to observe the small details that others overlook." The village of Little Wickham would recover from this tragedy, as villages do, but the lesson remained. Beneath the most civilized surfaces, human nature continues to struggle with its darker impulses, and sometimes those impulses require the gentle but persistent investigation of those who understand that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most respectable. The arrest of Mr. Finch brought Little Wickham the temporary relief that accompanies any tidy conclusion to disturbing events. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by details that refused to settle into place with the comfortable finality that Inspector Craddock's case required. She'd observed too many investigations where the first plausible solution proved to be merely the most convenient, and something in young Finch's confession carried the rehearsed quality of a man repeating lines he had learned rather than experiences he had lived. Forensic contradictions. Inspector Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage the following afternoon with the subdued manner of a man whose certainties had been shaken by inconvenient facts. "The laboratory findings present some difficulties," he admitted, settling into a garden chair with obvious reluctance. "While we found digitalis on the violet cup's rim as expected, there are no traces whatsoever on the sugar tongs Finch claimed to have used. The waxed paper bears only the faint scent of citrus, consistent with Mrs. Hartwell's lemon drops, not with any chemical preparation." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this information. "How very curious, Inspector. One might wonder whether Mr. Finch's confession was shaped more by what he believed we expected to hear than by what actually occurred." "The method he described matches the evidence," Craddock replied, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Perhaps the tongs were cleaned more thoroughly than we anticipated." "Young men who commit murder for the first time," Miss Marple observed mildly, "are rarely so methodical about destroying evidence while simultaneously preserving it in labeled vials. It suggests either remarkable criminal sophistication or remarkable criminal naivety, and I'm not certain which would be more troubling." The second attempt. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps on the garden path. May appeared at the gate, her face flushed with exertion and her usual composure entirely abandoned. "Miss Marple, please come quickly. Mrs. Hartwell has been taken ill. Something terrible has happened." The scene at Rosemary Cottage bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the previous day's tragedy, though this time the victim had been discovered in time. Mrs. Hartwell lay in her bedroom, pale but conscious. while Dr. Kent administered treatment with the focused intensity that serious poisoning required. On the bedside table sat a cup bearing the residue of cocoa, its surface marked by film that seemed somehow different from the usual skin that forms on cooling milk. Digitalis again, Dr. Kent confirmed grimly, his examination of the cup revealing the telltale signs he had learned to recognize. If Timothy hadn't insisted on checking on his aunt before retiring, we might have lost her entirely. Timothy Fletcher stood near the wardrobe, his face bearing the particular pallor of someone who has narrowly escaped witnessing a tragedy. "I prepared the cocoa myself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Evelyn always finds it soothing before bed. I use the same tin, the same spoon, everything exactly as she prefers." Miss Marple examined the cocoa tin with gentle interest, noting the fine powder that clung to the measuring spoon despite Timothy's obvious attempts at cleanliness. "How thoughtful of you to care for your aunt's comfort," she said diplomatically. "Though I notice the spoon bears traces of something rather finer than cocoa powder." The pattern emerges. Inspector Craddock's arrival transformed the bedroom into an impromptu crime scene, complete with the careful documentation that serious investigation required. "Finch is in a locked cell," he announced grimly, "which means our murderer is still at large." The implications settled over the assembled company like morning fog, dense, obscuring, and thoroughly unwelcome. Someone among their small circle had attempted murder twice, succeeding once and failing only through fortunate timing on the second occasion. The careful positioning of evidence, the methodical preparation, the intimate knowledge of household routines, all suggested a killer who understood their victims' habits with disturbing precision. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with her characteristic attention to detail. Timothy's obvious distress seemed genuine, yet his position as the person who had prepared the fatal drink placed him under inevitable suspicion. Dr. Kent's medical expertise made him valuable as a witness, but also reminded everyone of his earlier status as a suspect. May's hysterical insistence on her innocence carried the ring of truth, but also revealed her access to the household's daily routines. Village reactions. The news of a second poisoning attempt spread through Little Wickham with the speed that only genuine terror can achieve. Mrs. Pemberton, her usual appetite for gossip tempered by the realization that she might be sharing tea with a murderer, began locking her doors for the first time in decades. Colonel Rook announced his intention to take his meals at the pub until the matter was resolved, while Reverend Merriweather offered special prayers for protection against evil in their midst. "The whole village feels different now," Mrs. Hartwell confided to Miss Marple during one of several visits to check on her recovery. "One looks at neighbors differently when one knows that someone among them harbors such terrible intentions. The comfortable assumptions about safety and familiarity have been shattered entirely." Dr. Kent, whose medical knowledge had made him both valuable and suspect, found his practice affected by the community's new wariness. "Patients ask different questions now," he observed to Miss Marple. "They want to know exactly what medications I'm prescribing, whether treatments are truly necessary. Trust, once broken, proves remarkably difficult to restore." Timothy's burden. Young Timothy Fletcher bore perhaps the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that his well-intentioned care for his aunt had nearly resulted in her death. His nervous energy, previously channeled into helpful domestic tasks, now seemed to manifest as anxious, hovering, and excessive concern for details that had never troubled him before. "I keep reviewing every step," he confided to Miss Marple during one of her visits. "The tin was in its usual place, the spoon clean, the milk fresh from the dairy. Yet somehow, poison found its way into a cup I prepared with my own hands. It makes one question everything, every kindness, every gesture of care." Miss Marple studied the young man with gentle sympathy, noting the genuine distress that marked his features. Evil often succeeds by corrupting our better impulses. She replied softly, "The fact that your kindness was exploited does not make kindness itself dangerous. It makes it more precious and more necessary." The investigation deepens. Inspector Craddock's renewed investigation revealed several disturbing facts that cast the entire case in a different light. The digitalis found in both poisoning attempts had been prepared using the same method and concentration, suggesting a single perpetrator working with consistent materials and techniques. More troubling still, the poison had been applied to items that required intimate knowledge of the victim's preferences and routines. Mrs. Hartwell's favorite cup, her customary bedtime cocoa, her nephew's caring habits. "We're dealing with someone who understands this household's daily rhythms with extraordinary precision," Craddock observed to Miss Marple. The killer knew exactly which cup Mrs. Hartwell would use for honored guests, exactly how Timothy would prepare his aunt's evening comfort, exactly when and how to strike for maximum effect. This realization narrowed the field of suspects considerably while simultaneously making the investigation more complex. The murderer was not a stranger exploiting random opportunities, but someone with sustained access to the victim's most private routines and preferences. Miss Marple's growing certainty. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to the question of motive and opportunity. The careful staging of evidence against both Dr. Kent and Mr. Finch suggested a mind that understood not only the mechanics of murder, but also the psychology of investigation. Someone had orchestrated events with the specific intention of directing suspicion toward innocent parties while concealing their own involvement behind a facade of shocked respectability. The pattern was becoming clearer. 2 attempts on Mrs. Hartwell's life, disguised as random tragedy and misdirected blame. The question that remained was why someone would want the gentle, well-regarded hostess dead, and who among their small circle possessed both the knowledge and the ruthlessness to attempt such calculated murder. As evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she organized her thoughts. The truth was emerging through patient observation and careful attention to the small inconsistencies that revealed character. Tomorrow would bring new revelations. She was certain, and with them, perhaps the final pieces of a puzzle that had already cost one life and nearly claimed another. The murderer had planned well, but they had not accounted for the persistent investigation of those who understood that the most dangerous criminals often hide behind the most respectable facades. And that, Miss Marple reflected with quiet determination, would prove to be their undoing. The morning after Mrs. Hartwell's near-fatal encounter with poisoned cocoa brought Inspector Craddock back to Little Wickham with the grim determination of a man whose neat theories had been shattered by inconvenient facts. The release of Mr. Finch on police bail had done nothing to ease the village's growing anxiety. If anything, it had widened the circle of suspicion to include neighbors who had shared tea and gossip for decades without a second thought. The London Connection. Revealed. Miss Marple received Inspector Craddock in her sitting room, where the morning light revealed the careful attention she had been paying to a collection of newspaper clippings and correspondence that had arrived with the early post. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I believe we must examine young Timothy Fletcher's recent circumstances more thoroughly. His departure from London was not quite as voluntary as he has led us to believe." Craddock consulted his notebook with the systematic precision that serious investigation required. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. We've traced his employment history. Timothy was dismissed from his position at Hartwell and Associates, ironically, a firm that bears his family name but has no connection to it, for what they termed irregularities in client accounts. Nothing prosecuted, but enough to make future employment in finance impossible. The implications settled over their conversation like morning mist, dense, obscuring, and thoroughly unwelcome. Timothy's cheerful return to village life, his helpful presence around his aunt's household, his eager assistance with social arrangements, all took on a different complexion when viewed through the lens of desperate financial necessity. "How much did he take?" Miss Marple inquired, with the gentle directness that had served her well in previous investigations. "Nearly £300 over 6 months. Small amounts, carefully concealed, but the pattern was unmistakable once they began looking. He was also speculating with clients' funds, investments that failed spectacularly just before his departure." Craddock's expression reflected the particular disappointment that comes from discovering criminal behavior in someone previously considered merely unfortunate. Village observations. Mrs. Pemberton, whose position at the post office made her an unofficial chronicler of the community's correspondence, provided additional details that painted an increasingly troubling picture. 3 urgent telegrams to London in the past month, she confided to Miss Marple with the satisfaction of someone whose professional discretion had finally found appropriate outlet. All marked for immediate delivery, all to addresses in areas where gentlemen don't typically conduct respectable business. The pattern that emerged was one of mounting desperation. Timothy had been borrowing from increasingly dangerous sources, using his aunt's respectable address and his family connection to secure loans that his actual circumstances could never support. The interest payments alone would have consumed any legitimate income he might hope to earn in Little Wickham. And then Mr. Blackwood arrived, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, with his plans for development and his eye for profitable opportunities. A man who would naturally investigate property titles, family histories, and financial arrangements that might affect his investments. The method becomes clear. Dr. Kent, whose medical knowledge had made him both valuable witness and potential suspect, provided crucial insight into the technical aspects of the poisoning attempts. The digitalis used in both cases was prepared using the same method, he explained to Miss Marple during one of his visits to check on Mrs. Hartwell's recovery. Concentrated extract, carefully measured, applied with precision that suggests both botanical knowledge and access to proper equipment. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this information. Timothy spent considerable time in the garden during his visits home from London. His aunt mentioned how helpful he was with the flower arrangements, particularly the tall spikes from the border. "Foxgloves," Dr. Kent confirmed grimly. "The entire plant is toxic, but the leaves contain the highest concentration of active compounds. Someone with chemistry knowledge, which Timothy would have acquired in his financial work, could easily extract and concentrate the digitalis using household equipment." The household evidence. Young May, whose observations had proven valuable throughout the investigation, provided the final pieces of the technical puzzle. "Master Timothy always insisted on warming the spoon when preparing cocoa," she confided to Miss Marple. "Said it prevented lumping when the powder met the milk. Very particular about it, he was. And he always arranged the tea service himself when there were special guests. Said it was his way of helping Aunt Evelyn maintain her reputation for perfect hospitality." The picture that emerged was one of calculated access and intimate knowledge. Timothy understood his aunt's social customs, her favorite pieces of china, her evening routines, and her generous impulses toward honored guests. He had been present for every crucial moment, the preparation of the violet cup, the arrangement of the tea service, the preparation of the bedtime cocoa that nearly claimed his aunt's life. Family secrets. Miss Marple's investigation into the Hartwell family history revealed additional motivations that cast Timothy's actions in an even darker light. Mrs. Lavinia Potts, whose memory contained decades of village gossip and genealogical detail, provided crucial background about the family's financial arrangements. "The Hartwell property has always been entailed," Mrs. Potts explained with the authority of someone who had witnessed several generations of local drama. "Passes to the male line when possible, but there are provisions for female inheritance under certain circumstances. Timothy, being his aunt's closest male relative, would inherit if she died without children of her own." This revelation added another layer to the mounting evidence. Timothy faced not only immediate financial pressure from his London creditors, but also the long-term prospect of inheriting substantial property if his aunt were to die. Mr. Blackwood's investigation into local property rights and development opportunities would inevitably have uncovered these inheritance arrangements, making him a threat to Timothy's future security. The psychological profile. Inspector Craddock's renewed questioning revealed the psychological strain that Timothy had been concealing beneath his cheerful demeanor. "He's been taking laudanum," Dr. Kent reported after examining the young man's increasingly erratic behavior. "Small doses, probably for anxiety, but enough to affect judgment and increase desperation." The combination of financial pressure, family obligation, and chemical dependency created a volatile mixture that explained both the calculated nature of the crimes and the increasingly desperate attempts to deflect suspicion. Timothy had begun with a carefully planned murder designed to eliminate a threat to his inheritance while directing suspicion toward obvious alternatives. When that failed to provide the security he needed, he had attempted to murder his aunt directly, staging it to appear like the work of the same external threat. Miss Marple's deduction. As the evidence accumulated, Miss Marple found herself considering the particular tragedy of a young man whose desperation had corrupted the very relationships that should have provided him with support and security. Timothy's crimes were not the product of inherent evil, but of circumstances that had gradually eroded his moral foundation until murder seemed like a reasonable solution to insurmountable problems. "The saddest aspect," she confided to Inspector Craddock, "is that Mrs. Hartwell would undoubtedly have helped him if he had simply asked. Her generosity toward family is well established, and £300, while substantial, would not have been impossible for her to manage. Instead, he chose deception and violence, believing that his aunt's death would solve problems that honest confession might have resolved." Preparing for confrontation. As evening approached, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock prepared for the delicate task of confronting Timothy with the accumulated evidence. The young man's increasingly erratic behavior suggested that he was nearing a psychological breaking point, making him both more dangerous and more likely to make the fatal error that would provide final proof of his guilt. "We must be very careful," Miss Marple warned. "Desperate people in desperate circumstances are capable of actions they would never contemplate under normal conditions. Timothy has already demonstrated his willingness to harm those closest to him. Cornered, he may prove even more dangerous." The stage was set for a final confrontation that would either bring justice for Mr. Blackwood's murder and the attempt on Mrs. Hartwell's life, or result in further tragedy if Timothy's desperation drove him to even more extreme measures. The truth was finally emerging, but Miss Marple knew from long experience that the most dangerous moment in any investigation came when the guilty party realized that their carefully constructed deceptions had been discovered. As the village settled into another uneasy evening, the residents of Little Wickham remained unaware that their quiet community was about to witness the final act of a tragedy that had been building for months, driven by the toxic combination of financial desperation and family obligation that had transformed a troubled young man into a calculating murderer. Miss Marple's invitation to afternoon tea at Rosemary Cottage carried the deceptive simplicity that marked her most effective investigations. She had arranged the gathering with particular care, Mrs. Hartwell still pale from her recent ordeal but determined to maintain normal social routines. Dr. Kent, whose medical expertise remained valuable, and Timothy Fletcher, whose nervous energy had grown increasingly pronounced as Inspector Craddock's investigation narrowed its focus. The strategic setting. The sitting room bore Miss Marple's characteristic attention to meaningful detail. She had placed a small vase of foxgloves on the side table, their purple bells nodding innocently in the afternoon light, so common in village gardens as to seem entirely natural. Near the tea service lay several squares of waxed paper, ostensibly for wrapping seed cake portions, and the sugar bowl contained lumps of varying sizes, including one notably irregular specimen that caught the light differently from the others. "Such a comfort, having family nearby during difficult times," Miss Marple observed as she poured tea, her gentle gaze settling on Timothy with grandmotherly warmth. "Though I imagine the responsibility weighs heavily on young shoulders, particularly when one has other concerns to manage." Timothy accepted his cup with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Aunt Evelyn's recovery is my primary concern, Miss Marple. Everything else seems rather insignificant by comparison." "How admirable," she replied, noting the way his eyes flickered toward the waxed paper squares before returning to her face. "Though significant problems rarely resolve themselves through neglect, do they? They tend to grow more pressing with time." The gentle pressure. Dr. Kent, understanding his role in Miss Marple's careful orchestration, observed Timothy's behavior with clinical attention. "The young man seems under considerable strain," he murmured to Miss Marple, just loudly enough for Timothy to overhear. "The physical symptoms are quite pronounced: elevated pulse, perspiration, the particular pallor that accompanies sustained anxiety." "Perhaps some cocoa would be settling," Timothy suggested with forced brightness, rising abruptly from his chair. "I could prepare it exactly as Aunt Evelyn prefers." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Though I believe we should avoid any unnecessary preparation just now. Inspector Craddock mentioned how important it is to maintain careful routines during an investigation." Her needles clicked softly as she continued her knitting, the sound somehow emphasizing the deliberate nature of her words. Timothy's face drained of color. "I don't understand why my helping with household tasks should concern the inspector." "Oh, it's not the helping itself," Miss Marple explained with patient kindness. "It's the particular knowledge such help requires. For instance, knowing that cocoa masks bitter flavors more effectively than tea, or understanding exactly which cup Mrs. Hartwell reserves for honored guests. Such intimate familiarity with domestic routines can be quite revealing." The behavioral evidence. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple drew attention to seemingly innocent details that carried deeper significance. When Timothy reached for the sugar tongs, she observed aloud how the implement bore a distinctive scratch along one arm, so small as to be nearly invisible, yet precise enough to suggest contact with something harder than sugar crystals. "Curious how such marks appear," she mused, examining the tongs with apparent fascination, almost as if someone had scraped something from a surface, or perhaps applied something to one. The kind of careful work that requires warming the implement slightly to ensure proper adherence. Timothy's hand jerked away from the tongs as if they had burned him. "I'm sure I don't know anything about that." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed sympathetically. "Though it's remarkable how our habits reveal us, isn't it? The way you instinctively warm spoons before stirring cocoa, for instance. Such a thoughtful technique for preventing lumps and for ensuring that any fine crystals dissolve completely into the mixture. The psychological breaking point." The accumulated weight of indirect accusation and gentle observation finally shattered Timothy's carefully maintained composure. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice carried the desperate edge of someone whose defenses had been systematically dismantled. "You don't understand," he burst out, the words tumbling over each other in their haste to escape. "None of you understand what it's like to have everything falling apart while everyone expects you to maintain appearances. The debts, the threats, the constant pressure. Something had to be done." Mrs. Hartwell, who had been listening with growing horror, reached toward her nephew with trembling fingers. "Timothy, what are you saying?" "Blackwood was going to destroy me," Timothy continued, his confession pouring forth with the relief of long-suppressed truth. "He'd discovered everything, the borrowed money, the failed investments, the lies I told to secure loans. He said he couldn't allow someone with my flexible relationship with financial truth to remain in the community. And then he started investigating the property arrangements, the inheritance laws. The complete revelation. Miss Marple set down her knitting with gentle finality. You prepared the digitalis extract over several weeks, using equipment from the village school's chemistry laboratory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate the immediate threat while directing suspicion toward others who had obvious motives for wanting Mr. Blackwood gone. Timothy nodded miserably, his resistance completely exhausted. I thought if I could just remove him, I'd have time to sort everything out. Aunt Evelyn would never have to know about the disgrace, and I could find legitimate work, pay back what I owed. But Mr. Blackwood's death didn't solve the fundamental problems, Miss Marple continued with compassionate understanding. The creditors were still demanding payment, and the investigation was drawing attention to exactly the circumstances you hoped to conceal. That's when you realized that your aunt's inheritance was the only solution. And that's when you tried to poison her cocoa. Justice and resolution. The sitting-room door opened to admit Inspector Craddock, who had been listening from the adjacent hallway with the patience that serious investigation required. Timothy Fletcher, he announced with quiet authority. I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Ambrose Blackwood and the attempted murder of Evelyn Hartwell. Timothy offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied, his spirit broken by the weight of confession and the realization that his carefully constructed deceptions had been thoroughly unraveled. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her shock and betrayal, insisted on accompanying her nephew to ensure he received proper legal representation, a gesture of family loyalty that spoke to the generous nature that had nearly cost her life. Village reflection. As news of Timothy's arrest spread through Little Wickham, the community struggled to reconcile their image of the helpful young nephew with the calculating murderer he had revealed himself to be. The revelation forced uncomfortable questions about how well neighbors truly knew each other and how financial desperation could corrupt even the most apparently respectable individuals. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting as the official proceedings concluded, reflected on the particular tragedy of a young man whose pride and desperation had led him to choose violence over honesty. The saddest aspect, she observed to Inspector Craddock, is that confession of his difficulties might have prevented all of this tragedy. But fear of shame often proves more powerful than the hope of redemption. As evening settled over the village, Little Wickham began the slow process of healing from the trauma of murder and betrayal within its midst. The case would long be remembered as a reminder that even the most peaceful communities harbor secrets that can erupt into violence when circumstances align in particularly unfortunate ways, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately emerges through patient observation and understanding of the darker aspects of human nature. The murderer's careful plans had been undone not by dramatic confrontation or forensic evidence, but by the quiet persistence of an elderly lady whose understanding of human behavior ran deeper than any criminal's capacity for deception. In the end, as always in Miss Marple's experience, the truth had revealed itself to those patient enough to observe the small details that others overlooked. The drawing room at Rosemary Cottage had been arranged with Miss Marple's characteristic attention to meaningful detail. She had invited the key participants for what she termed a final clarification of recent events. Mrs. Hartwell, still pale from her ordeal but determined to understand the truth. Dr. Kent, whose medical expertise remained crucial, Timothy Fletcher, whose nervous energy had grown increasingly pronounced, and Inspector Craddock, whose methodical investigation required proper conclusion. The strategic revelation. Miss Marple had positioned a small arrangement of foxgloves on the side table, their purple bells catching the afternoon light with deceptive innocence. Near the tea service lay several items that had featured prominently in the investigation. The repaired violet cup, sugar tongs bearing their distinctive scratch, and squares of waxed paper that seemed to hold memories of their own. "It has been a most instructive case," Miss Marple began gently, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. "One that demonstrates how desperation can corrupt even the most natural affections," and how careful observation reveals truth despite elaborate misdirection. Timothy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flickering between the foxgloves and the violet cup with the involuntary attention of someone whose nerves had been stretched beyond their limits. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup, then withdrew without touching it. The method explained. The murder of Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple continued with gentle precision, required intimate knowledge of village social customs and household routines. The killer understood that Mrs. Hartwell would wish to honor her guest with her finest china, specifically the violet cup that she reserves for special occasions. This knowledge could only come from someone who had observed these rituals repeatedly, someone who understood the hostess's generous impulses. She paused to examine the repaired cup with apparent fascination. The digitalis was applied to the inside rim of the cup using a method that required both botanical knowledge and access to proper preparation facilities. The village school's chemistry laboratory, accessible through keys obtained for harvest festival preparations, provided the necessary equipment for extraction and concentration of the active compounds. Timothy's face had gone ashen, but Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness. The sugar tongs and the irregular lump were clever misdirection, designed to suggest a crude poisoning method while concealing the sophisticated preparation that actually occurred. The scratch on the tongs came from scraping harmless lemon residue to create the appearance of contamination, while the waxed paper bore traces of ordinary sweets, not poison. The psychological pressure. "What troubles me most," Miss Marple observed, her gaze settling on Timothy with grandmotherly concern, "is the attempt on Mrs. Hartwell's life. The first murder might have been explained as desperate elimination of a threat, but the second attempt revealed something far more calculating. The pursuit of inheritance through the death of someone who had shown nothing but kindness and generosity." Timothy's composure finally cracked under the weight of gentle but relentless logic. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to go so far. Blackwood was going to destroy everything, my reputation, my future, my family's standing in the community. And then when the investigation began focusing on innocent people like Dr. Kent, so you decided that removing your aunt would solve multiple problems," Miss Marple concluded softly. "The inheritance would provide financial security, and her death would appear to be the work of the same external threat that had killed Mr. Blackwood." The complete confession. The psychological dam burst completely as Timothy's carefully maintained facade collapsed. "I prepared the digitalis over several weeks, using the school laboratory when I was helping with festival preparations. I knew Aunt Evelyn's habits so well, her favorite cup, her evening cocoa routine, her generous impulses toward guests. It seemed like the perfect solution to impossible problems." He buried his face in his hands as the full weight of his actions became clear. "But I never anticipated how it would feel afterward. The guilt, the horror of watching innocent people come under suspicion, the realization that I had become something monstrous. When I tried to poison her cocoa, I was already planning to confess, to end the nightmare I had created." Justice and resolution. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with quiet authority as Timothy's confession concluded. "Timothy Fletcher, I am arresting you for the murder of Ambrose Blackwood and the attempted murder of Evelyn Hartwell." The handcuffs were applied with professional courtesy, though Timothy offered no resistance, his spirit broken by the weight of revealed truth. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her shock and betrayal, insisted on ensuring that Timothy received proper legal representation, a gesture of family loyalty that spoke to the generous nature that had nearly cost her life. "He is still my nephew," she said simply, "and whatever he has done, he deserves justice, not vengeance." The village response. As news of Timothy's arrest and confession spread through Little Wickham, the community struggled to reconcile their image of the helpful young nephew with the calculating murderer he had revealed himself to be. The revelation forced uncomfortable questions about how well neighbors truly knew each other and how financial desperation could corrupt even the most apparently respectable individuals. Dr. Kent, whose reputation had been restored, reflected on the irony that his medical knowledge had made him both valuable witness and convenient suspect. It demonstrates how easily circumstantial evidence can be manipulated by someone who understands the assumptions others will make. Mrs. Pemberton, whose appetite for gossip had been sobered by proximity to real tragedy, found herself questioning the casual speculation that had been her stock in trade. It makes one realize that behind every piece of village gossip might lie genuine human suffering that we treat as entertainment. Miss Marple's final reflection. As the official proceedings concluded and the village began its slow process of healing, Miss Marple reflected on the particular tragedy of a young man whose pride and desperation had led him to choose violence over honesty. The saddest aspect, she observed to Inspector Craddock, is that confession of his difficulties might have prevented all of this tragedy. Mrs. Hartwell's generosity would certainly have extended to helping a nephew in financial distress. But shame often proves more powerful than hope, and fear of temporary disgrace can lead to permanent catastrophe. The case served as a reminder that even the most peaceful communities harbor secrets that can erupt into violence when circumstances align in particularly unfortunate ways. Justice had been served through patient observation and understanding of human nature, but the cost in trust and innocence would take far longer to restore than the time required to solve the mystery itself. As evening settled over Little Wickham, the village faced the complex task of rebuilding the social fabric that had been torn by betrayal and violence. The comfortable assumptions about safety and familiarity would need to be reconstructed on a foundation that acknowledged both the capacity for evil and the importance of compassion in human nature. Miss Marple's gentle but persistent investigation had revealed the truth, but healing the wounds left by that truth would require the patient work of an entire community committed to remembering that, even in the darkest circumstances, human kindness remained both possible and necessary. The murderer's careful plans had been undone not by dramatic confrontation or forensic science, but by the quiet persistence of an elderly lady whose understanding of human behavior ran deeper than any criminal's capacity for deception. In the end, as always in Miss Marple's experience, the truth had revealed itself to those patient enough to observe the small details that others overlooked, and justice had emerged through careful attention to the inconsistencies that betrayed character beneath its carefully constructed facades. The weeks that followed Timothy Fletcher's arrest brought to Little Wickham the particular quiet that settles over communities after they have witnessed the darker aspects of human nature. By the time the Michaelmas daisies had lifted their pale faces along the hedgerows, the village was attempting, with that curious English tenacity, to return itself to ordinary life. Yet beneath the resumed rhythms, bells on Sunday, the post-bicycle clattering past on weekdays, the thrum of bees in gardens where foxgloves now seemed to nod with more solemn grace, lay the permanent alteration that comes from proximity to calculated evil. Justice and legal resolution. Timothy's trial proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that serious criminal cases required, drawing curious observers from surrounding villages to the county courthouse. The evidence presented painted a devastating picture of calculated deception masked by familial affection, a betrayal that struck at the very foundations of trust within family relationships. Timothy's detailed confession left little doubt about the outcome, and his sentence of life imprisonment was pronounced with the grave finality that such crimes demanded. Miss Marple attended the proceedings with quiet dignity, though she found the formal legal process less satisfying than her own patient investigation had been. The courtroom focused on establishing guilt and determining punishment, while her interest lay in understanding the human failures that had led to such tragic consequences. Inspector Craddock, whose investigation had been guided by her subtle insights, reflected afterward on how traditional detective work could be enhanced by understanding human psychology rather than relying solely on physical evidence. Mr. Finch, whose nervous behavior and access to confidential information had made him a convenient scapegoat, faced lesser charges for breaches of professional confidence. He departed Little Wickham in a dawn motor, quietly and with the stubborn dignity of a man who had made mistakes but was no murderer. "A pity," Craddock observed to Miss Marple, about a young man who mistook cleverness for character. Individual healing and transformation. Mrs. Hartwell's recovery proved more complex than the simple healing of digitalis poisoning. The physical effects faded under Dr. Kent's careful treatment, but the psychological trauma of discovering that her beloved nephew had attempted to murder her for financial gain required far longer to process. She moved through her daily routines with determined normalcy, yet those who knew her well observed subtle changes: the way she examined her mail with new wariness, the careful attention she paid to household arrangements that had once been automatic. "The worst aspect," she confided to Miss Marple during one of several visits, "is not the physical danger I faced, but the realization that someone I loved and trusted was capable of such calculated cruelty. It makes one question every kindness, every gesture of family affection." On her sideboard, the violet cup had been repaired and then quietly retired to a high shelf, not quite banished, but out of daily reach. In its place stood a sensible, sturdy pot, pretty enough but no longer a token of special honor. Hospitality, Miss Marple noted, had grown a little less ceremonial and a little more cautious. Dr. Kent's practice, though restored to respectability, bore the invisible scars of false accusation. His reputation, once cleared, seemed stronger for having survived the test, yet the experience had taught him uncomfortable lessons about how quickly suspicion could fall upon anyone with knowledge and opportunity. "I suppose it is a doctor's lot to see the worst of human ailments," he mused to Miss Marple. "But to see the worst of human nature, especially among those one considers friends and neighbors, is a far more bitter pill to swallow." His patients, initially wary, gradually returned, though their questions carried new undertones of caution that had never existed before. Mrs. Pemberton, whose appetite for gossip had been sobered by proximity to real tragedy, discovered that her role as the village's informal chronicler carried responsibilities she had never previously considered. Her observations, once freely shared as entertainment, now came tempered with the understanding that casual speculation could destroy innocent reputations. "We can't know what pressures people bear," became her new refrain, awkward at first, then gradually natural, as the village learned to balance curiosity with compassion. The Ambrose Fund and Lila's legacy. A fortnight after the trial's conclusion, Mrs. Pemberton had the satisfaction of processing papers that established the Ambrose Fund, fulfilling a promise found in Mr. Blackwood's final correspondence. Lila Grant, who had seemed at once too modern and too vulnerable for Little Wickham, had discovered among his effects a letter declaring his intention to withdraw from aggressive development schemes and instead establish a modest trust for cottage repairs and educational scholarships. "If he had lived," Lila confided to Miss Marple before her departure, "he would have done better than I imagined. He was beginning to grow up." Miss Marple pressed her hand gently and suggested that promises could be kept by proxy. The fund, with Lila as trustee and Reverend Merriweather as chair, became a tangible legacy that transformed potential destruction into community benefit. Community healing and lasting change. The village's recovery proceeded with the gradual pace that emotional healing requires, yet the comfortable assumptions about safety and familiarity could never be entirely restored. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now routinely secured. Casual conversations carried new undercurrents of caution, and every friendly face now held the potential for hidden depths and previously unimagined motivations. Colonel Rook, ever practical, found his carefully cultivated sense of order profoundly shaken. His hedges remained impeccably trimmed, but the belief that external discipline could guarantee internal peace had been damaged. In an unprecedented display of neighborliness, he offered Mrs. Hartwell a cutting from his cherished yew for a gap that has long troubled me, speaking less loudly about property lines and more often about weather, a transformation that surprised even himself. On Sundays, Reverend Merriweather preached with gentleness uncommon to his more exuberant style, speaking of confession not as spectacle but as mercy, of truth as a physician's bitter draught. The congregation, which had taken to glancing sideways at one another, listened without fidgeting and sang hymns that rose thinly at first, then with growing confidence as the community slowly rebuilt its capacity for shared faith. Miss Marple's final reflections. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple reflected on the case within the broader context of human nature and social responsibility. The village had survived its encounter with evil, but it had been changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. Communities are like gardens, she observed while tending her roses. They require constant attention and care to remain healthy. When we ignore the signs of disease or corruption, we risk losing much more than we realize. Timothy's crimes had not been inevitable. They were the result of circumstances that careful attention might have prevented. His education had given him the knowledge necessary to commit sophisticated murder, but it had not provided him with the wisdom to recognize that temporary disgrace was preferable to permanent catastrophe. The tragedy lay not merely in the deaths and suffering he had caused, but in the waste of potential that desperation had created. Inspector Craddock made one final visit, bringing a small parcel oddly wrapped. "From the evidence room," he said with dry humor. "With my compliments. It seemed more yours than ours." Inside lay the sugar tongs with their tiny scratch, now polished to innocent brightness. Miss Marple smiled and placed them in her drawer, with elastic bands and lengths of string, useful things misused once, restored to their proper purpose. The village's new equilibrium. On an evening when the sky held the tender blue of old china and the first stars appeared above the rooftops, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and thought of cups and persons and the marks that hands leave on both. One does not solve murders with cleverness alone, she reflected. One notices who warms a spoon, who glances at waxed paper, who uses a favorite thing in a way not quite in character. One remembers that human nature commits the same small treacheries whether in London boardrooms or village parlors, and that guilt betrays itself in domestic gestures. The cup chosen, the cocoa stirred with unusual care. The village would never entirely forget the murder over afternoon tea. It would become a story whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. But life, Miss Marple knew, possessed a remarkable capacity for resilience, for finding new ways to bloom even in scarred ground. The human spirit, for all its flaws, could rebuild and discover beauty even after the most profound disruptions. The clock on her mantel struck the hour. Somewhere, Colonel Rook's dog barked. Somewhere, Mrs. Pemberton drew her blind. Somewhere, Dr. Kent thanked a late patient at the door. The village breathed as villagers do, uneasily still, perhaps, but living. Miss Marple folded her knitting and set it aside, satisfied that truth had prevailed and justice had been served, however painful the process. Tomorrow would bring new small concerns, and those, she had always found, were the surest antidote to tragedy. The great matters of life and death had played themselves out over afternoon tea. Now there was bread to bake, letters to write, and roses that needed tending. That, in the end, was how Little Wickham would heal, through the return of kindly habit and the quiet wisdom of people who, having seen the worst, chose once more the ordinary good. The delicate balance of village life had been restored, albeit with a deeper understanding of the darkness that could lurk beneath the most peaceful surfaces and the courage required to face it with grace.